Hey, how's it going? It's Keith Townsend from the CTO Advisor. I'm coming to you day two, at least day two of CTO Advisor interviews at Datrium in Silicon Valley, where we're doing the vBrownBag Build Day with Datrium's DVX system. Amazing opportunity to see the behind the scenes of how to actually install the unit, how it integrates in a traditional customer's environment. Speaking of customer environment, I'm joined by the CEO of Datrium, Biles, the VP of Product Management, Tushar.
Hey.
Thanks for joining me. So first off, there's a lot of similar products in the market to your solution, at least in concept. You guys, I love it that you've come out with this term, open convergence. I've actually seen it in other places in the market. People will actually know it, but you guys are, I've learned over the past couple of days via Hugo, quite different. First off, what problem are you guys solving with the open convergence concept versus what we've seen in the market when it comes to hyper-converged?
We're trying to simplify tier one. So if you, and kind of as a secondary thing, we also bundle in data protection in a way that's very deep and architectural. So at the tier one side, it solves three basic pains. The first is, you have a big SQL database and you want predictable low latency. Very hard for hyperconverged to do.
Yes.
So kind of a scale-up server problem. Second, you want a bigger pod to manage. You don't want small clusters. You don't want the sort of cluster rigidity of hyperconverged where, it's half a dozen monolithic server types that share I/O and I/O intensity. You want to be able to mix and match and grow to, say, 50 or 100 servers without having to worry so much about how the subcluster is constructed. Third, you want to pull in any kind of server type, brownfield, whatever, mix and match. All of these things are classic sort of tier one deployment problems for servers. Hyperconverged doesn't get you there, we do.
So, Brian, I understand that message. It's pretty straightforward. I have a brownfield. I have stuff in my data center that's still depreciating. I'm going to need to use it years into the future. I need some type of control plane I can put over it, solve this data protection. We talked to Devin about the different use cases people have been using the data protection portion of the DVX for. When you're talking to CIOs who are under constant pressure to move to some level of cloud, how is that conversation? How do you help to explain the value of Datrium's DVX beyond the low-level details of the solution?
Well, there's a fundamental question at the top of that of what workloads are you going to put sort of off-prem into a cloud environment, a SaaS or something you build on Amazon, and what are you going to keep on-prem? That's a sophisticated question, and it depends on the price performance, how much you want to outsource. For example, the early markets for Amazon were mostly outsourced data center markets, and it's better than what IBM used to do.
Right.
But for the people that want something on-prem, they want it to be as simple as possible because they don't want to have a lot of operating expense in dealing with it. And in that spirit, a couple of changes have been going on. One is that arrays are declining because you always need storage management as a unique specialty.
Right. SAN
management. Convergence can resolve that. Hyperconvergence especially gives you VM granularity management, and that means you're not dealing with LUNs, and that's simpler. It means as you add hosts, you add speed automatically, although sometimes in spotty ways. So that transition has been happening on-prem independent of us, that people are moving away from arrays toward convergence and hyperconvergence. As that movement happens, it turns out there are exposures in that set of opportunities that really hasn't resolved for tier one. It hasn't resolved for bigger databases with consistent latency, with scale-up hosts, with bigger pods. All these things are classic enterprise problems.
Yeah.
You don't want lots of things to manage.
And you take your traditional applications, something like an SAP, or even not even just a traditional installation of SAP. You have SAP HANA, which SAP is extremely restrictive on how you run storage compute next to analytic compute. So you have to separate those two out, and your open convergence system seems kind of perfect for that traditional data center workload that may not go into the cloud at any point.
Right. So we're focused in this interesting way on these two sets of problems. One is how to do a sort of bigger pod, much more server flexibility, much more consistent low latency. But we're also tying it together with built-in, architecturally deeply built-in VM backup and data protection that also replicates to clouds and lets you store them. So that's also a very interesting new thing. If you look at the landscape of data protection, there are, the analysts would tell you about 15% of enterprise doesn't use backup software today. Mm. In 3 years from now, that'll be 30%. That's an enormous change, right? That's not well covered. But the reason is VM granularity data protection is getting more and more built into on-premise infrastructure.
Yeah, the plug for the CTO advisor, December 8th, we're doing a Backup is Dead podcast. For these very reasons, 15% of enterprises are not using backup. Backup is a legacy concept, I think, in itself. So, Tushar, talk to me about what customers are saying, the feedback about the product as they're starting to dip their toe into cloud functionality.
Yeah.
What's the number one use case and demand for feature?
Yeah, sure thing. Great. So happy to. So I think, as Brian said, the focus for Datrium has been to really simplify the life for customers and administrators. And that's exactly what we are hearing from a lot of our customers. My number one comment from customers is, I don't have to think about it anymore. And so what we find is a lot of customers who were spending 10 hours a week, 12 hours a week managing their storage are now being freed up from all that time because we've designed something that's super simple to deploy, but also simple and scalable, and it's pretty much self-managing to a large degree, right? From a cloud perspective, I think the pillars of what Datrium is truly focused on is truly simplifying convergence not only on-prem, but also including hybrid cloud as a big element of that convergence. And so what we are hearing from customers is they want to keep a long-term retention of copies of snapshots that they're keeping on their on-prem site. They can use the Datrium cloud software to essentially keep those copies in a public cloud on a pay-per-go basis, pricing in a much more elastic and as a service manner, where they don't have to worry about the cloud. We take care of all the difficult aspects for them and simplify the cloud so they can just consume.
So as customers are being freed up of this responsibility, I love the comment that I'll quote Alistair from vBrownBag earlier when I asked him, hey, how's the build going and what's the results? What's the early impressions? You know what, you just don't have to manage this stuff, is what he basically said. It's amazing in the sense that it's freed up from just his installation, what he has to manage day two. So it's about day two operations. So Brian, can you talk to me about day two operations? What are some of the CIOs and CTOs you're talking to? What are they talking to you about when it comes to day two experience with DVX?
Well, it's kind of as Tushar said, as Alistair said, our demo is kind of like watching a Corona beer commercial. There's nothing to do. There's nothing. Right. There's nothing there. Like storage management goes away. Even hyper-converged cluster administration, where you set up, do you want dedupe or compression or whatever on a particular shared storage range of hosts, that goes away because everything's always on. We've built this in such a way that we can be fast and maximize every efficiency technique all at the same time, so we just leave it all on. We just did a benchmark with iomark.org and the evaluator group, where the iomark test is a test of how many VMs you can run with consistent low latency in a shared store. And they basically keep adding VMs until it breaks, until latency goes too high. We broke the current hyper-converged benchmark by about 10x. We did 8,000 VMs compared to 800 with I think that was vSAN with Optane. What's so crazy hardware. Wow. We beat the prior best benchmark for an all-flash array, the IBM V9000, by 5x. And this is, in our case, we did it with encryption in software, global deduplication, inline compression, and erasure coding, two failure tolerant erasure coding, which are our defaults, all set. In all these other, in the benchmarks we competed against, that was all turned off. They did like RAID 1, no data reduction. It's a complete
race car.
Yeah, it's ludicrous how scalable.
It is a stock. It's a stock car, but it's not really stock.
Yeah. So taking all performance management off the table, just by saying, configure your host to whatever speed you need, and then you're done. That's just it breaks a lot of other products.
Right.
So,
and then just to quickly add to that, we did all that with 2/3 the latency of those other offerings. So even with that performance, our latencies were way better than the alternatives.
Yeah, I was also impressed with the pod size. Tushar, can you talk about we talked about the large failure domains versus the small failure domains, or large parts versus small pods. Talk a little bit about that build. How big was that cluster? Well, not cluster, that DVX?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of answered that in two ways. So this particular environment was about 128 hosts or compute nodes.
That's about the size of a data center.
That's exactly right. And that was coupled with 10 of our all-flash data node products. And so that was the result we got with that. But then more interestingly, what we find with a lot of our existing deployments as well is that we've had a number of customers who have used over 30 hosts with a single data node in production. And so this is a proof point for the actual delivery on the promise of the open convergence architecture, where having stateless hosts allows us to scale elastically to a massive amount of degree, and even with that, provide customers with the reliable and predictable performance that they expect.
So Brian, I'll give you last word. What do you want to leave the CTO, senior architect level audience? What is the last message you want to leave off to them in this broadcast?
The reason to talk to Datrium is if you want to simplify your on-prem architecture with a bridge to the cloud. And in simplifying your on-prem architecture, your infrastructure, you want to get coverage of all your apps, but especially your tier 1 apps. It's a thing we can do better than anybody. With a mixture of host types from wherever you want to get them, and tie in complete and robust VM data protection, policy-based VM granularity or container granularity, so you don't have to buy separate backup, software and storage products with encryption end-to-end.
So with that said, I want to thank you for again tuning in to the CTO Advisor Daily Dose with special sponsorship by Datrium, and thanking the vBrownBag team for inviting the CTO Advisor to tag along to their little build day. I like seeing behind the scenes, even though they left me in a room with the DVX and there was a red cable and I really wanted to pull it. I didn't. Talk to you next, CTO Daily Dose.